Seattle was drowning in endless October rain. Drops monotonously drummed on the windows of the FBI building, turning the city behind the glass into a blurred watercolor. James Holder stood at the panoramic window of his office on the 12th floor, looking out at the gray landscape and machine adjusting his impeccably tied tie. On his desk waited a stack of reports on the case of the largest identity theft. Hackers had broken into 3 banks on the West Coast, stealing information on millions of customers. Beneath the folder of reports was the Avenue Ripper case. 4 victims in 6 months. Holder methodically went through the photos of the dead women. There was something they had in common, other than the manner of murder, but no one had yet picked up on the connection. He gently touched the photo of the last victim, beautiful, well-groomed, wearing expensive jewelry. Just like the other one 25 years ago, a sophisticated predator who had destroyed their family. 20 years of impeccable service had taught him patience. Criminals always make mistakes, you just have to know how to wait. 3 high-profile cyber fraud cases in the last year have made him a rising star in the Bureau. A personal commendation from the FBI director adorned the wall among other honors. In his 45, he'd achieved everything he'd dreamed of in academia: a leadership position, the respect of his peers, an exemplary marriage to a brilliant criminalist. His smartphone vibrated quietly. A message from Catherine. "Don't wait up for dinner. New results on the Ripper case." A floor below, his wife was bent over a microscope in her perfectly organized lab. The serial killer, who had terrorized Seattle for the past 6 months, had finally made the mistake of leaving a piece of skin at the crime scene. Catherine had been working for 14 hours straight, forgetting lunch and dinner. She'd always been like that, obsessive, methodical, perfect. Once it had delighted James, now it was vaguely irritating. "The results will be ready in a couple hours," she said as he peered into the lab. "We finally have the killer's DNA." Holder nodded, keeping a nonchalant expression on his face. He ran his hand over the keyboard of her computer. "Will you run it through all the databases?" "Sure. Although, weird. Access to the federal database is restricted for some reason. I'll have to call tech support." "I'll look into it." He leaned over the monitor. "You know, sometimes the system glitches because of incompatible updates. I'll fix it." A knock on the door snapped Holder out of his reverie. "Come in." "Agent Holder? I'm Emma Price, your new secretary." She was quite different from the previous assistant. Dry Miss Jenkins, retired after 30 years of service, Emma radiated youth and energy. Dark hair gathered in a strict bundle. Business suit emphasized a slender figure. But the main thing, eyes. The intelligent, attentive eyes of a man who was clearly aiming higher than a secretarial position. "Have a seat, Miss Price. I trust you've already been shown the office." "Yes, Agent Baker gave me a tour. You have a terrific department. I was especially impressed with the technology lab." Holder noticed how avidly she looked around the office, lingering her gaze on the wall of awards and photographs. One picture showed him standing next to the director of the FBI, an awards ceremony after solving a biometric theft case. The other was an academy graduation, 1999. A completely different Holder. Young, with thick dark hair, without gray on his temples. But there were no family photos in his office. He didn't like to mix personal and work. "Have you worked in law enforcement before?" "No, but I studied criminology at the University of Washington. I dreamed of going to the FBI Academy." "Why didn't you?" "Knee injury, sports injury. Didn't pass physical training." There was a lingering bitterness in her voice. Holder nodded understandingly. He knew the pain of losing a dream. Her record showed gymnastics, a hopeful athlete, and an injury at the last competition before Olympic selection. "Well, let's start with the current cases. There's a folder on the table with the Cyber Priest case reports. We need to organize the data on the latest attacks." For the next 2 hours, they immersed themselves in their work. Emma grasped everything on the fly, asking precise questions, quickly grasping specific terminology. At one point, she accidentally touched the Ripper case file, and the photos scattered across the table. "I'm sorry." She hastily gathered up the pictures. "It's horrible. What he's doing to these women." "Everyone gets what they deserve," Holder said softly, taking the photos from her. Familiar footsteps were heard in the hallway. Robert Baker was making his evening rounds of the department. The chief was known for his integrity and strictness. Last year, he'd fired 2 agents for having an office romance, despite their spotless records. "There's no room for personal relationships in the FBI," was his favorite phrase. Baker looked into the office. "Holder, how's the new secretary?" "Doing great, sir." "Good. Miss Price, don't forget to sign all the non-disclosure papers." "Already done, sir." Baker nodded approvingly and moved on down the corridor. That evening, sitting at dinner with Catherine in their perfect home overlooking the bay, Holder caught himself thinking about Emma, about the way she bit her lip, concentrating on the documents, the way she easily grasped the gist of his assignments, of how graceful her fingers look on the keyboard. "James?" Catherine's voice snapped him out of his reverie. "Are you listening to me?" "Sorry, darling. Thought about work." "I'm saying I'm close to a breakthrough in the Ripper case. The sample has traces of a rare genetic marker. That narrows it down." "That's wonderful," he said mechanically, and his fingers gripped the fork a little harder than usual. Catherine returned to her monologue about tissue decomposition and DNA markers. Holder looked at her tired face and thought about the last time they'd had a real conversation that wasn't about work. A year ago? 2? Their marriage had become a partnership of 2 workaholics living parallel lives. At the time, Emma Price sat in her small apartment on the edge of town, looking through a forensics textbook. On the desk lay a manual for FBI agents. She still hadn't given up hope of one day becoming one of them. The laptop screen glowed with a page of James Holder's personnel file. She'd found an article about his latest successful investigation. On the bedside table was a photograph. A young gymnast in a brightly colored suit, with a medal around her neck and a bright smile. A completely different Emma. Before the injury, before the collapse of her dreams, before the need to find a new path in life. Outside the window, the rain continued to pour. Seattle was covered in a fog that blurred the outlines of skyscrapers and the fate lines of its inhabitants. February was unusually cold. The rain that had poured down on Seattle for the past 4 months was replaced by prickly snow. In the morning, the puddles were covered with a thin crust of ice, and the windows of the offices were covered with frosty patterns. Emma was already accustomed to putting a cup of black coffee on Holder's desk, 2 spoonfuls of sugar, no milk. In 6 months, she'd learned all his habits, the way he frowned as he reviewed reports, the way he tapped his fingers on the desk as he pondered a difficult decision, the way he loosened the knot of his tie slightly after 6 in the evening. "Thank you." He touched her hand fleetingly, taking the cup. That touch, so casual at first glance, made her heart skip a beat. They had learned to communicate almost without words, glances, gestures, casual touches. The Avenue Ripper was laying low. There hadn't been any new victims in a month. Holder regularly reviewed the case files, ostensibly to help his wife. The latest victim particularly interested him. Sarah Mitchell, 32, had stolen her husband from her best friend. Like the previous 4 women, she had destroyed someone else's family. It was a coincidence no one had noticed until now. It all started in December, when they were working late into the night on a case involving the hacking of government servers. A simple hack turned into a multi-layered investigation with a flavor of international espionage. Holder didn't go home before midnight for weeks at a time, and Emma stayed with him, helping to organize the data. That night, she brought him Chinese food from the restaurant around the corner. He'd missed dinner again. They sat in his office discussing the latest findings, and something changed in the air. Perhaps fatigue was to blame, or the dim light of the desk lamp, or the cozy silence the 2 of them shared. "You're amazing," he said suddenly, and kissed her. Now, 3 months later, Emma no longer remembered how she'd lived before. Her world had narrowed to meetings in an empty office after work, rare dates at her house on the outskirts of town, stolen moments alone. On his free evenings, Holder often lounged at his computer, immersed in lines of code. He liked to work with databases. Everything there was subject to strict logic. Everything could be controlled. He was considered one of the best digital security specialists in the bureau, a reputation he'd earned from long nights behind a monitor. "There's a new academy enrollment in Quantico," Emma said casually, laying fresh reports on Holder's desk. "Maybe we should try again? The knee isn't bothering much anymore." He shook his head. "Emma, we talked about this. You know the rules. No romantic relationships between agents, yes, but I'm not an agent yet. You realize perfectly well that would complicate things. She understood, but she couldn't stop daydreaming. This is some kind of nightmare, Emma said, watching the news on her tablet. A new Ripper victim had been found, a young woman, an affair with a married businessman, a silk scarf. So many victims and no leads. No DNA found in the databases? Holder asked absent-mindedly, thinking about the upcoming system update. No, your wife must be going crazy with helplessness. He wrinkled his nose. He didn't like it when Emma mentioned Catherine. Their relationship was teetering on the brink. By day, the impecunious special agent Holder and his efficient secretary, Miss Price. Evenings, furtively clasped hands, kisses in an empty conference room, rare meetings at her house when Catherine was on lab duty. Emma kept every proof of their connection. The occasional selfies of them laughing about something on the phone together, receipts from restaurants, printouts of messages. She told herself it was for memory. But somewhere deep inside, she knew it was her insurance. Maria, the elderly janitor on the evening shift, often caught the two of them together. She just shook her head and pretended not to notice. But one day, when she caught them kissing in an empty office, she couldn't help herself. Aye, Mr. Holder. That's not nice. He pulled away from Emma abruptly, pulled back his jacket. Maria, listen. I didn't see anything. I didn't hear anything. The cleaning lady raised her hands and hurried out. Holder saw her off with a look that flashed something dark. A week later, he ran into Maria in an empty hallway and asked her a long time about her family, about how hard it was to raise her grandchildren alone, about how important her job at the FBI was. We need to be more careful, he told Emma. In early March, Emma felt strange. At first, she put it down to stress and sleep deprivation. Then she noticed she'd missed her cycle. The test she bought at the drugstore on the way home showed 2 stripes. She sat on the edge of the tub for a long time, staring at the plastic wand that had turned her life upside down. Her mind was spinning with scraps of thoughts, how James would react, what to do next, whether she could keep it a secret. Her phone vibrated. A message from him. I'm running late at the office. Need your help with the reports. Emma looked at her reflection in the mirror. Outwardly, nothing had changed, but inside, everything turned upside down. She pulled a folder out of her desk drawer where she'd put all the evidence of their affair. Now she had a trump card stronger than restaurant receipts. The office was in an uproar as the Ripper's 7th victim was found. This time he'd left a message. No one escapes payback. Holder looked thoughtfully at the crime scene photos. This woman had destroyed a family too, like his mother had 25 years ago, like Emma might have done. Emma? His voice sounded unaccustomedly soft. Are you okay? You look pale. We need to talk, she said quietly. In private, it's important. A flicker of concern flashed in his eyes. He sensed something in her tone, some new resolve. For a moment, his fingers tightened on the silk tie. All right, tonight, after work. Emma nodded and returned to her desk. Her hand rested on her stomach absent-mindedly. Somewhere in there, still unseen, their future was ripening. Or their doom. Outside the window, the snow fell again, covering the city in a white shroud. Seattle lay in wait for spring and more upheaval. Emma arrived at the office earlier than usual on the subway. She got off twice at random stations. Unable to cope with the nausea, she stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a long time, rehearsing the conversation, but all the words seemed wrong. How do you tell a person you're going to ruin their life? How do you explain that you have no choice? A crumpled pharmacy receipt lay on the surface of the sink. She shoved it into her pocket, though she usually always threw it away. The empty office smelled of coffee and lemon floor cleaner. Emma turned on her computer, pulled out of her bag a folder of documents she'd been collecting for the past few months. A few photos of them together, correspondence, restaurant receipts, seemingly small things, but together they added up to a clear picture of a workplace romance. She didn't want to use it as a weapon, but she had no choice. Holder showed up at the beginning of 9, unusually animated. Brought her coffee from her favorite coffee shop. Usually it was the other way around. The smell of coffee made her sick again. You look tired. Rough night? She nodded silently, unable to look up. A news feed window flashed on the computer screen. The body of the Avenue Ripper's 8th victim has been found. Police refused to comment. The article was peppered with details. A young woman, a silk scarf, the location of the discovery, again, near Pioneer Square. Next to the crime scene photo was a picture of the victim, a smiling blonde with a trendy haircut. Jane Foster, 29, worked for a real estate company. According to co-workers, had been dating a married man for the past 6 months. James! Catherine peeked into the office, pale from lack of sleep. A coffee stain was visible on her usually immaculate blouse. "We need to talk. Alone." They stepped out into the hallway Emma could see through the glass partition as Catherine explained something fervently, waving a file folder. Holder listened with his head slightly bowed, his face expressionless. Only the jowls moved under his skin, a sure sign of the tension Emma had learned to notice over the months. The day dragged on interminably. Twice Emma tried to start a conversation, but each time something got in the way. An urgent call from Washington, or an unscheduled meeting on the data theft case. She felt time slipping through her fingers. At 2 o'clock, an email came from the technical department. Holder took longer than usual to read the text, his fingers clenched faintly on the mouse. Tomorrow at noon, the letter read, all federal databases would be upgraded to the new version. Important. All local settings will be reset. Emma didn't understand why such mundane technical information made him frown. There was talk in the corridors about the Ripper's new victim. Some of the analysts speculated that the killer had access to data on his victims. He was too good at picking his time and place. Others argued about a possible connection between the murdered women, but no one could find a common denominator. Catherine reappeared closer to evening, excited, eyes blazing. "I'm almost there, James. Just a few more tests to run. That DNA, there's something odd about it. It's like she's hiding from us." The office gradually emptied. Maria rattled buckets in the hallway, humming a Spanish song. An elderly cleaning lady lingered outside Holder's office longer than usual, wiping the glass. She remembered catching him and Emma yesterday. I, she muttered to herself again. Emma gathered all her courage and knocked on the office door. "Come in. We need to talk now." He nodded, setting the papers aside. The office smelled of coffee and his favorite cologne. Outside the window, the lights of nighttime Seattle flickered. A clock ticked on the wall, a gift from Catherine for her 5 years of service with the Bureau. "I'm pregnant." Silence. Only the ticking of the clock on the wall. Somewhere in the hallway, Maria kept humming her little song. "Are you sure?" "Yes, and I'm going to keep the baby." He rose slowly from the table. "Emma, I've made up my mind, and if you don't back me up, I'm going to Baker. I have proof. All the proof. Let's talk quietly. Not here. Come to my house." "Your house? Are you crazy?" "No, you're right. I'll come to your place. At about 11 o'clock. We need to talk things over." The snow outside the window turned to rain. Emma sat in the kitchen of her small apartment, staring at the screen of her phone. She opened her notes, started typing, "If anything happens to me," and erased it. Nonsense. A new dress hung in her closet. She'd bought it last week, dreaming of a future together. Now, it seemed like a mockery. The doorbell rang. "Hi, I brought wine, non-alcoholic." In the morning, Emma didn't show up at the office. Holder quietly went over the reports, glancing at his watch from time to time. In the lab, Catherine was tinkering with test tubes. "New data on the Ripper case?" one of the lab techs asked. "Yes, but they're kind of confusing. We need to double-check." By noon, Baker noticed the secretary's absence. He peered into Holder's office, tapping a folder on the palm of his hand, a gesture that always signaled displeasure. "She asked for time off," Holder replied evenly. "Not feeling well." The work was piling up. He checked the update email again, still the same time, noon. On the desk lay the morning paper with a picture of the Ripper's latest victim. Holder absent-mindedly ran his finger over the photo. At 6 p.m., Baker reappeared in his office, already irritated. "Holder, where's your secretary? She's not answering her cell phone." "I don't know, sir. She was a little unwell yesterday." Send a driver after her. Have him make sure she's all right. Sir, I don't think... That's not a request, Agent Holder. Outside the window, the snow began to fall again. Half an hour later, the phone rang in the office. The driver spoke confusedly, panting. Sir, the door is open. There's a body here. There was a commotion in the office. Holder sat motionless, staring out the window at the lights of the evening city. His face remained calm. It was snowing relentlessly. Detective Prudence Chen was the first to arrive on the scene, followed by forensics. The small fifth-floor apartment smelled of wet plaster and the faint scent of perfume. Emma lay on the bed as if she were asleep. The silk scarf draped around her neck seemed inappropriately dressy. On the bedside table stood an untouched bottle of non-alcoholic wine, 2 glasses. The phone on the kitchen table, screen smashed. Exactly the same handwriting, Chen muttered, looking around the room. Same knots on the scarf, same body position. He even brought flowers just like all the previous ones. The white roses in the crystal vase had already begun to fade. 9 roses, the number of victims. The Avenue Ripper was always meticulous about details. Time of death? Chen turned to the medical examiner. Preliminarily between 11 p.m. and 1 o'clock in the morning. I'll tell you more precisely after the autopsy. In the corner of the room was an open suitcase, half-packed. It looked like the victim was going somewhere. A used pregnancy test was found in the bathroom, 2 stripes. Find out who the father is, Chen ordered, and check all her contacts for the last month. The FBI office was quiet. Most of the staff had already gone home. Holder lingered, methodically sorting through the papers on his dead secretary's desk. In the lab, Catherine had been running DNA tests for 12 hours. There was something odd about the latest results, but she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. Before lunch, she ran a final check. The new database update should give more accurate results. Mrs. Holder, why don't you go home? The young lab technician handed her a cup of coffee sympathetically. You've been here since this morning. Just a little longer. I want to wait for the results. She walked down to the cafeteria, feeling tired for the first time all day. The news of her husband's secretary's death had shocked everyone, but work couldn't be stopped, especially now that she was so close to a breakthrough. Catherine was slowly making her way up the stairs when her cell phone vibrated. A notification from the lab, analysis complete. A match has been found. She hurried into her office, spilling coffee on her blouse, opened the program, stared at the screen for a few seconds, unable to believe her eyes. Then her hand reached for the phone. Sir, this is Catherine Holder. Can you come up to the lab? Right away. It's urgent. Baker came running in 3 minutes later, still in his coat. The snow was melting on his shoulders, droplets falling to the lab floor. What have you got? See for yourself. Catherine turned the monitor toward him. They stared at the screen in silence. Baker took off his glasses, wiped them clean, put them back on. No, it can't be, he shook his head. There must be a mistake. I don't believe it either. But look at the markers, a perfect match. Run it again, all the tests, from the beginning. The next hours merged into an endless series of tests. Catherine methodically checked every sample, every result. Baker sat beside her, occasionally going out for a new batch of coffee. At 10 o'clock, Holder peeked into the lab. Catherine, aren't you going home? Not right now. She carefully kept her eyes off the microscope. Important tests. I might be up all night. I see. He hesitated in the doorway. I'll see you tomorrow then. His footsteps fell silent in the hallway. Catherine and Baker glanced over. Run the last test. At 11:45, the computer beeped again. A new notification. Analysis complete. Previous match confirmed. Catherine rose slowly, leaning on the table. The lab was quiet, just the hum of instruments and the dripping of water somewhere. James Holder, she said aloud, looking at the name on the screen. Oh my God. All this time. It was James. James Holder had been arrested at 7 in the morning as he was leaving his house. 3 cars, a SWAT team. Like for a particularly dangerous criminal. He didn't resist, just adjusted his tie before he was handcuffed. In the interrogation room, Prudence Chen laid the printout of the DNA analysis in front of him. "Your wife ran everything very thoroughly, Agent Holder. 3 times. He was silent, staring at one point over her shoulder. The lawyer next to him was quickly writing something down. "Your DNA is a perfect match to the samples found on all 9 of the Ripper's victims." Silence. A week later, he still hadn't said a word. Sitting in a holding cell, methodically exercising, reading newspapers. When questioned, all he'd say was, "No comment." And then a letter arrived. To Robert Baker from Emma Price, subject. "If you are reading this letter, dear Mr. Baker, if I have not canceled the sending of this letter, and you are reading it, then I am dead. Probably at the hands of a man you know as a model agent. James Holder, the Avenue Ripper." I realized it yesterday when I accidentally saw the database-altering code on his computer. He'd been hiding his DNA from searches for years using his official position. Attached, you'll find all the evidence of our connection. But most importantly, there's a copy of his program. He used it on all the victims, women he believed were destroying families, like his mother 25 years ago. He got me pregnant, and I was going to destroy families too. Emma Price, Baker called in the tech department. The programmer spent hours studying the code Emma had sent. "Genius," the head tech finally said. "He created a filter that makes certain data invisible to search engines. When the database update went through in the night, his defenses went down." That same evening, Holder was brought in for questioning again. He was still silent until Chen put the printout of Emma's email in front of him. "She guessed it," he finally uttered. "Smart girl, too smart. Tell us everything." "You know what all the victims had in common? They were just like my mother. Beautiful, ambitious, unscrupulous, destroyers of families." He spoke calmly, almost relieved. "I was 15 when she left me for a married man. My father drank himself to sleep, and I swore they'd all pay one day. Why the silk scarf? She was wearing one when she left. Blue, with white flowers. Emma. She was different. I really loved her, but she turned out to be the same too. Ready to destroy the family, ready to blackmail. Can you believe she even put together a dossier on me?" He shook his head. "I couldn't let her. You killed 9 women. I got justice." He corrected his tie with a familiar gesture. They all deserved their fate. As it later turned out, 12 hours decided everything. A programmer in the technical department in Washington, a young intern named Green, had been celebrating a birthday the day before and had mixed up the time to run the update. Instead of noon, the system updated at midnight while Holder was asleep after Emma's murder. When Catherine started her tests in the morning, the bases were already running without his filter. Holder was sure he had until noon to restore the cloak. He didn't even realize the update had already happened, and his precious code that had hidden the truth for so many years had long since stopped working. 9 lives, 25 years of preparation, a flawless plan, all ruined by a trifling error in a single digit. Outside the window it was snowing. February in Seattle was particularly cold. Somewhere in the lab, Catherine was packing her things, preparing for a transfer to another city. And in the pre-trial detention cell, James Holder was methodically making notes in a notebook. He was beginning to write his memoirs. He was sure that one day the world would realize he was right. The 9 white roses in Prudence Chen's office slowly crumbled, dropping petals on the Avenue Ripper case file. The case was closed. Portland greeted Catherine with torrential rain just like Seattle. New lab, new co-workers, new last name. She'd reverted to her maiden name, Catherine Meyer. Sometimes she wondered if she really knew the man she'd been married to for 15 years. The newspapers were full of headlines about the Ripper case. James was found sane, to the disappointment of his lawyers, who tried to build a defense of insanity. He methodically described each murder without showing a shadow of remorse. His memoirs had already been offered for purchase by 3 publishers. Catherine didn't go to the hearings, didn't read the news. Only sometimes, bent over a microscope in her new lab, she remembered how she spent years looking for the criminal who slept in the same bed with her, how she'd marveled at his technical skills, how she'd overlooked the obvious. Her new apartment overlooked the river. In the evenings, she would sit on the balcony, watching the barges go by, and think about those 9 women, about how James had methodically stalked them, charmed them, killed them, and then come home for dinner, kissed her on the cheek, asked her how her day had been. She no longer wore silk scarves, and white roses now made her nauseous. One day in March, a year after James's arrest, a new case landed on her desk: a serial killer who strangled his victims. Catherine opened the folder, ran her fingers over the photos of the dead. "I'll take this one," she said. "I won't miss a detail this time." The rain outside the window was getting heavier. Somewhere in a maximum security prison, James Holder continued to write his memoirs, and the 9 white roses on Emma Price's grave were slowly wilting under the Seattle sky. Catherine turned on the microscope and plunged into her work.